The night my voice escaped the walls of our house, I did not mean for the world to hear it. I only meant to speak the truth once, quietly, into the safety of darkness. I thought the truth would stay between me and God. I thought it would disappear like breath on glass. But instead, it spread, beyond my bedroom, beyond our street, beyond our city, beyond our country. And by the time I realized what was happening, there was no way to take it back. People began calling us brave. Others called us traitors. Some called us liars. Some called us miracles. All I knew was this: I was 14 years old, my family was terrified, and everything we had tried to keep hidden was now visible. My name is Nour el-Amani. I was born in the north of Morocco, in a quiet town where life moves slowly, where neighbors know each other's routines, yes, where families guard their reputations carefully, and where silence is often considered safer than honesty. My world was small: school, home, family, prayer, routine. I did not grow up rebellious. I did not grow up searching for attention. I grew up trying to disappear into expectations, to be a good daughter, to be a respectful student, to be a quiet presence. No one ever expected my story to travel farther than these narrow streets, least of all me. But stories have a way of escaping when they are no longer willing to be buried. Before everything changed, my life looked ordinary from the outside. A modest home, loving parents, younger siblings who laughed too loudly and fought over everything. A family that cared deeply about honor, tradition, and belonging. We were not extreme. We were not political. We were not controversial. We were simply careful, like most families around us. Careful with words, careful with behavior, careful with appearances. Because in places like mine, perception often matters more than truth. What people never saw was the quiet weight I carried long before anything spiritual ever happened. A heaviness I could never explain. A feeling that I was performing a life rather than living one. Even as a child, I remember lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, feeling like something inside me was asking questions that had no safe place to go. Questions about meaning, about purpose, about identity, about why the heart can feel crowded even when the room is full. I did not speak those questions aloud. I learned early that some thoughts are better kept silent, so I learned to smile when expected, to behave when praised, to follow patterns when uncertain. And for a while I convinced myself that this was what peace looked like. But peace should feel light. Mine felt heavy. The shift did not happen in one dramatic moment. It did not begin with rebellion or conflict. It began in quiet ways, almost invisible ways. A sense of being seen when I had always felt overlooked. A sense of being known when I had never spoken my deepest fears. A sense of being loved without conditions I could ever earn. I did not tell anyone at first. Not my friends, not my siblings, not my parents. Because when something fragile enters your life, the instinct is not to share it. The instinct is to protect it, to guard it, to hide it. Especially when you sense that others may not understand. Especially when you sense that misunderstanding could become danger. And yet the truth has a strange nature. It does not remain quiet forever. It grows, it moves, it changes the way you see everything else. It alters the tone of your thoughts. It reshapes your heart. And eventually it begins to reveal itself whether you intend it to or not. That is how it began in our home, slowly, almost imperceptibly. A shift in atmosphere, a change in conversations, a softness that had not existed before, a peace that did not come from rules or effort or appearances. What I did not know at the time was that I was not the only one changing. I did not know that my mother had begun experiencing things she could not explain. I did not know that my father, the strongest voice in our household, was wrestling silently with questions he had never allowed himself to ask. I did not know that even my younger siblings were feeling drawn towards something they could not name. We were all walking separate paths toward the same truth without realizing we were walking together. And then came the recording. The message I sent without fully understanding its reach. The words I whispered, thinking they would dissolve into the internet's endless noise. The testimony I believed would remain anonymous, buried under thousands of others. Instead, it found listeners. It found sharers. It found millions. Suddenly, strangers knew our story before we had fully understood it ourselves. Suddenly, our private transformation became a public phenomenon. Suddenly, safety felt fragile. Because when something sacred goes viral, it becomes vulnerable. And when a family's quiet faith becomes visible, the world does not always respond gently. I am telling you this not because I want attention. I never wanted that. I am telling you because silence is no longer an option. Because once truth begins to move, it carries responsibility. Because maybe, just maybe, someone listening to this story recognizes the same quiet questions in their own heart. And if that is you, then perhaps this story found you for a reason. If you choose to stay and hear the rest, you are not just listening to a story about a girl in Morocco. You are stepping into a journey of fear, discovery, loss, courage, and faith that reshaped an entire family. And if you feel something stirring inside you already, something you cannot explain, then I gently ask you to stay close. Follow this story. Leave a quiet sign that you were here. Not for numbers, but because sometimes courage begins with a simple acknowledgement. I heard this. It mattered to me. Chapter 1. Life before the change. Before anything spiritual entered our home, before anything miraculous, before anything dangerous, our life was shaped by routine. Not cruelty, not fear, just rhythm. Wake, school, homework, family dinner, sleep, repeat. It was a safe kind of life on the surface, the kind of life that looks peaceful to outsiders, a family that stayed together, parents who worked hard, a home that was neither rich nor poor, but careful with everything it had, careful with money, careful with time, careful with reputation. In towns like ours, reputation is not just about pride. It is survival. People talk, neighbors observe, families compare. Yet word travels faster than truth, and once a story begins, it never truly ends. So we learned early to live in a way that left no room for stories. My father was known as a respected man, not famous, not powerful, just honorable. A man who believed deeply in responsibility, who believed that his role was to protect, provide, and preserve. He believed a strong family was built on discipline and unity, not emotion. He was not cold, but he was reserved. Praise was rare. Vulnerability was private. Love was expressed through provision, not through words. My mother was the quiet strength of our home. Everything that held us together passed through her hands. Meals, animated emotions, conflict, comfort, organization. She did not speak loudly, but when she did, the house listened. Yet she carried the weight of everyone's needs with grace and exhaustion. Though I did not understand how heavy that weight truly was until much later. I had 2 younger siblings, a brother who still believed the world was simple, a sister who was beginning to realize it was not. Between them, I stood at the edge of childhood and adulthood, no longer innocent, but not yet allowed to question. 14 is an awkward age everywhere in the world, but in a place like ours, it feels heavier. Expectations become clearer, boundaries become tighter, behavior becomes more scrutinized. The room for exploration shrinks. You are expected to know who you are without ever being allowed to discover who you might be. That was my world. School was where I learned how to perform myself. I learned how to speak when spoken to, how to sit correctly, and how to smile at teachers, how to give answers that sounded respectful, not curious. Curiosity can be mistaken for defiance, and defiance, especially in young girls, is rarely forgiven. I was a good student, not because I was passionate about everything I learned, but because excellence felt like the only safe form of attention. If I succeeded, I was praised. If I struggled, I was questioned. If I questioned too much, I was redirected. So I learned the art of internal silence. To wonder quietly, to question privately, to feel deeply but express carefully. Outwardly, I was obedient. Inwardly, I was crowded with thoughts I could never fully name. I would lie in bed at night staring into the darkness, feeling the strange weight of existence pressing down on me. The awareness that I was alive, that time was passing, that life would not always be this moment. That childhood was slipping away, even though I did not know what waited on the other side. I remember feeling an unexplainable sadness even on ordinary days. Not depression, not despair, just a soft ache, like something important was missing, but I could not identify what, as though my heart was searching for something long before I had words for what it sought. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, but there was no language for it. In our home, emotional struggles were not discussed. Not because my parents did not care, but because caring looked different. It looked like protection from danger, not exploration of feeling. It looked like structure, not vulnerability. I learned that strong families did not talk about internal storms. They focused on external stability. So I became very good at appearing stable. What I never told anyone was how often I felt like I was watching my life from outside myself. Like I was playing a role rather than inhabiting a reality. Like I was performing the script of a good daughter while a deeper voice inside me remained unheard. Sometimes, when everyone else was asleep, I would sit by the small window in my room and look at the streetlights below. Cars passing, strangers walking, life moving. And I would feel this strange sense that somewhere out there, beyond this street, beyond this town, beyond this life, something else existed. Something fuller, something truer, something I had not yet touched. I did not know what that something was. I only knew it was absent. Religion in our home was present but not harsh. It was cultural, familiar, woven into daily life without dominating it. We respected tradition. We respected faith. But it was more inherited than explored, more practiced than understood. I followed because following was expected. I memorized because memorizing was praised. I believed because believing was assumed. But I did not feel connected. Not truly. I felt like someone standing outside a locked room, listening to voices inside but unable to enter. The rituals were there. The words were there. The structure was there. But intimacy was missing. Presence was missing. Peace was missing. No one else seemed to question this, so I assumed the problem was me. Perhaps I was too sensitive. Perhaps I was too introspective. Perhaps I expected too much from life. So I stayed silent. The strange thing about silence is that it allows everything to grow unnoticed. As my thoughts grew, my questions grew, my hunger for meaning grew, and no one knew. Looking back, I see now that the first signs of change did not appear as dramatic experiences. They appeared as small disturbances in the familiar rhythm of our home, subtle shifts in energy that I could not yet interpret. My mother began lingering longer in quiet moments, sitting still when she once busied herself constantly, staring out the window the way I used to, but with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not sadness, something deeper, like contemplation mixed with wonder. My father became more withdrawn in a different way. Not emotionally distant, but thoughtful. as if something was unfolding internally that he did not yet have language for. He spent more time alone, less time with distractions, more time in silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But children notice more than adults believe they do. Homes have atmospheres, families have emotional climates, and ours was changing, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. No one announced it, no one explained it, no one acknowledged it, but it was there. The dinners grew quieter, not from tension, but from something like reverence. The ordinary moments carried an unusual softness. Arguments that would normally escalate now dissolved quickly. Apologies came easier. Patience lingered longer. It was as if some invisible presence had entered our home, rearranging everything gently without forcing itself into view. At the time, I did not name it as spiritual. I simply felt it, and I felt myself changing too. The questions inside me were no longer only philosophical. They became emotional, existential, and personal. I began wondering not just about the nature of life, but about the nature of love, of truth, of forgiveness, of purpose. Why do we exist? Why does the heart crave meaning? Why does suffering exist? Why does love feel like both the greatest risk and the greatest necessity? These were not questions I discussed with friends. At 14, most conversations revolved around school, social media, appearance, and future dreams. I participated, but I often felt disconnected from those concerns. Not superior, just elsewhere. There was a growing sense that something beyond the visible world existed, something unseen but profoundly real. Not in a dramatic way, more like an undercurrent beneath everything. The change in me did not make me happier immediately. It made me more aware. And awareness, before understanding, is uncomfortable. I began noticing things I had never noticed before. The weight of certain words. The way kindness lingered longer than anger. The way genuine forgiveness softened the atmosphere of a room. The way love felt different when it was given freely rather than earned. I did not yet understand what any of this meant. I only knew that something inside me was waking up. And the awakening was not painless. There were nights when I would lie awake with a strange mixture of longing and fear. Longing for something I could not name. Fear of discovering what that longing might require of me. Because somewhere deep inside, I sensed that truth, real truth, would not simply comfort me. It would transform me. And transformation is never without cost. But at 14, I was not thinking in those terms yet. I only felt the tension, the sense that my inner world was expanding while my outer world remained unchanged. It created a quiet loneliness, not because I was alone physically, but because no one knew what was happening internally, or so I believed. What I did not realize yet was that the silence I thought separated me from my family was not distance. It was parallel transformation. We were not drifting apart. We were changing together, without yet knowing how deeply connected those changes would become. The first moment I realized something truly unusual was happening came on an ordinary afternoon. There was no dramatic event, no supernatural occurrence, no voice, no vision, just a moment. I returned home from school and found my mother sitting alone in the living room, hands resting in her lap, eyes closed. Not sleeping, just still, completely still. At first, I thought she might be unwell. But when she opened her eyes, there was a peace on her face that I had never seen before. Not the practical calm she usually carried, but something softer, something luminous. She looked at me as though she saw me more clearly than she ever had before. Not critically, not expectantly, but with an unfamiliar tenderness. She did not say anything, and neither did I. But something passed between us in that moment, an understanding without language, a recognition without explanation. That was the first time I sensed that whatever was happening was not only happening to me. From then on, these moments multiplied. Small exchanges, subtle glances, gentle changes in behavior, a warmth that had not existed before, a patience that seemed deeper than habit. But it felt as though a new layer of reality had settled over our household, quietly rewriting the emotional fabric of our family. Still, no one spoke openly about it. Not yet. And perhaps that was necessary. Because when something sacred begins to form, it often grows best in silence. The problem with silence, however, is that it creates space for uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds fear. By the end of that year, I was living in a strange in-between state. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything was shifting. I did not know what to call it. I did not know where it was leading. I did not know how much it would cost. I only knew that the life I had once accepted without question was no longer enough. And somewhere deep inside, I felt that the quiet transformation unfolding in our home would not remain hidden forever. And not because we wanted it revealed, but because truth, once alive, refuses to stay buried. If you have ever felt that same quiet stirring in your own life, the sense that something deeper is calling to you, even when you cannot yet explain it, then you understand how unsettling and beautiful that season can be. And if this chapter resonates with you, if it mirrors something in your own experience, then don't disappear silently. Let your presence be known. Not for attention, but because stories like this only matter when they are shared between hearts that recognize them. Chapter 2, The Encounter. There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts: before and after. At the time, I did not know that I was walking toward one of those moments. I thought I was simply moving through ordinary days, feeling the same quiet restlessness, the same unspoken longing, the same invisible tension that had become familiar to me. But something was building beneath the surface. Not loudly, not dramatically, gently, persistently, like water shaping stone over time. The change did not begin with light or sound or spectacle. It began with awareness, a heightened awareness of everything. I began noticing the emotional atmosphere of spaces the way someone notices temperature. Certain rooms felt heavier than others. Certain moments felt lighter. Certain interactions lingered long after they ended. Certain words felt as though they carried weight beyond their meaning. It was as if something within me had become more sensitive to realities I had never perceived before. I became more aware of suffering. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet way. The exhaustion in my mother's eyes that I had previously ignored. The pressure behind my father's silence. The loneliness in classmates who laughed too loudly. The insecurity behind arrogance. The unspoken grief carried by strangers on the street. Once you begin to notice suffering, you cannot stop seeing it. And once you see it, you begin to ask deeper questions. Why does pain exist? Why do people carry burdens in silence? Why does the heart crave healing so deeply? Why does love feel like both the most natural thing and the most difficult thing? I was not seeking a specific belief system. I was not searching for answers in a formal sense. I was simply becoming increasingly aware that there was more to reality than what I had been taught to see. But the world began to feel layered. The physical world, the emotional world, the unseen world. And somewhere between them, something was touching me. The first truly unusual experience came on a night that looked like any other. No tension, no conflict, no build-up, just stillness. I had gone to bed early. School had been tiring. My mind was crowded with thoughts I could not organize. I remember lying on my back, eyes open, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. Distant movement, soft breathing, the subtle hum of night settling over everything. That was when I felt it. Not fear, not confusion, not excitement, presence. It is difficult to explain presence without making it sound imaginary. But this did not feel like imagination. It did not feel like a thought I created. It felt like awareness of something already there. The room felt fuller, not physically crowded, emotionally full, as if the air itself carried meaning. I did not see anything. I did not hear anything. I did not feel touched, but I felt known. Known in a way I had never experienced before. Not observed, not judged, not evaluated, understood. The awareness lasted only seconds, but those seconds felt expansive, like time had slowed around them. When it passed, the room returned to normal, but I did not. I sat up in bed, heart calm, breath steady, mind unusually quiet. There was no fear, only a strange, unfamiliar peace. I did not tell anyone, not because I thought it was dangerous, but because I did not yet understand what had happened. How do you explain an experience when you lack the language for it yourself? So I carried it silently, but it did not happen only once. Over the next few weeks, similar moments began to occur. Always subtle, always gentle, always leaving behind the same after effect, clarity. I began to feel drawn toward stillness, toward quiet moments where I could simply sit and exist without distraction. Not because I was trying to practice anything, but because in those moments, the sense of presence returned more frequently. Sometimes while lying in bed, sometimes while walking home alone, sometimes while washing dishes, sometimes while sitting silently while others talked around me. It never felt forced. It never felt intrusive. It felt like invitation, as though something was waiting for my awareness rather than demanding my attention. And slowly, something else began to happen. My internal world started to change. The anxiety that had once followed me like a shadow began to soften. The heaviness that had weighed on my thoughts began to lift. The constant internal questioning began to quiet, replaced not with answers, but with trust. Not trust in doctrine, not trust in systems, not trust in explanations, trust in presence. It was as if I was being taught something, not through information, but through experience. That peace does not come from control. That identity does not come from performance. That love does not come from achievement. Those realizations did not arrive as thoughts. They arrived as felt truths. I found myself becoming more patient, more gentle, more emotionally open, not because I was trying to change, but because something inside me had softened. Even my reactions shifted. Moments that would have once frustrated me now passed more easily. Small irritations lost their intensity. When I began noticing how much energy I had previously spent resisting life, and how little resistance remained when peace was present, this frightened me. Not because the change felt wrong, but because it felt real. And real change implies consequences. The deeper the transformation became, the more I sensed that it would eventually require honesty. And honesty has weight. The night the encounter deepened beyond subtle presence came without warning. I had been exhausted emotionally, not from any specific event, but from the accumulation of internal processing. Sometimes growth is tiring. Sometimes transformation stretches parts of you that have never been stretched before. I remember lying in bed feeling heavier than usual, not sad, just overwhelmed. That was when the dream began, but it did not feel like a dream, yet it felt more real than waking life. I was standing in a vast open space, not a physical landscape I could recognize, but an environment that felt boundless. There were no walls, no ceiling, no ground that I could identify, only light, not blinding, not harsh, not overwhelming, warm. The kind of light that feels alive rather than illuminating. I did not see a figure, I did not hear a voice, but I felt communication, not through language, through understanding. The understanding that I was loved, not for what I did, not for who I appeared to be, but for who I was at my core. I became aware of every insecurity I had ever carried, every self-doubt, every fear of inadequacy, every belief that I needed to earn worth. And in that awareness came something that dissolved all of it. Acceptance, unconditional, complete, unquestionable. And it felt like being seen fully and still embraced. The weight I had carried for years dissolved in that moment, not gradually, instantly. There was no shame in that space, no performance, no expectation, no fear, only belonging. When I woke, my face was wet with tears I had not felt myself cry. Not tears of sadness, tears of release. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart racing not from fear but from recognition. Something real had happened, not psychological, not imagined, not symbolic, real. The following days were difficult, not because the experience itself was painful, but because of its implications. Once you experience something that feels more real than reality, you cannot simply return to life as it was before. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot unknow what you have known. The question became unavoidable. What was this? I was not searching for a new identity. I was not seeking rebellion. I was not trying to challenge anything. But something had entered my life that demanded understanding, and understanding required honesty. I began journaling in secret, writing not what I thought I should believe, but what I was experiencing. Not to analyze it, but to preserve it, to make sure I was not imagining it, to track its consistency. The experiences continued, not every night, not dramatically, but consistently enough to confirm that this was not a one-time emotional event. And gradually, another awareness emerged. This presence I was experiencing was not unfamiliar, not new, not foreign. It felt ancient. It felt intentional. It felt like something that had always existed, waiting patiently for my awareness. But I began noticing how the qualities I was experiencing aligned with a very specific pattern. Gentleness, patience, unconditional love, truth without condemnation, peace without pressure. It did not feel abstract. It felt personal. As if whatever this presence was, it knew me. Not the version of me that existed outwardly, the version of me that existed underneath everything. This realization brought both comfort and fear. Comfort because I no longer felt alone internally. Fear because I knew this kind of experience does not remain private forever. Real transformation changes behavior, and changed behavior invites questions. I began wondering if anyone else was experiencing anything similar. That thought terrified me, not because I wanted to be alone, but because the implications of others noticing change felt dangerous. Your change invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites misunderstanding. Misunderstanding invites conflict. So I did what I had always done. I remained silent. But silence could not stop what was unfolding. Because something else was happening in parallel. Something I did not yet know. And that realization would arrive soon. The final moment of the encounter, the moment that confirmed everything beyond doubt, came when I least expected it. It was not during a dream. It was not during a quiet moment. It was during ordinary life. I was sitting in the living room while the afternoon light filtered through the curtains. Nothing special. No atmosphere, no stillness, just daily existence. And suddenly, without warning, I felt it again. Stronger, clearer, closer. Not emotional, not psychological, personal. The awareness came with a sense of identity that I had never experienced before. Not a thought, not a belief, recognition. That the presence I had been encountering was not abstract, not vague, not undefined. It carried identity, not imposed on me, revealed to me. I did not see a name written in light. I did not hear a voice announcing anything, but I knew. In the same way you know your own name without being told. In the same way you recognize truth without explanation. In the same way you know when something aligns perfectly with reality. The realization was not emotional. It was undeniable. The presence was Christ, not as an idea, not as a cultural concept, not as tradition, as reality. The moment of recognition did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable, as though everything that had been unfolding quietly had been guiding me toward this awareness all along. And with that recognition came another understanding. This was not only happening to me. The atmosphere in our home, the change in my parents, the emotional shift in our family, it was not coincidence. Something had been moving through our entire household long before I became consciously aware of it. We were not drifting separately. We were being drawn together, toward the same truth, toward the same presence, toward the same transformation. I did not yet know how. I did not yet know when. I did not yet know what it would cost. But I knew this much. Nothing in our home would ever return to how it had been. And the most dangerous part was still ahead. Because the next thing that would happen would not come from me. It would come from my mother, and it would change everything. If you have stayed with this story this far, if you have felt the weight of it building slowly, if something inside you recognizes the reality behind these words, then do not brush that recognition aside too quickly. Experiences like this do not land randomly in the hearts of people who are merely passing through. Sometimes staying is not passive. Sometimes staying is the first act of courage. Chapter 3: The Secret Family Transformation. Once the realization settled inside me, nothing around me looked the same. The walls of our house were unchanged. The furniture remained where it had always been. The routines continued: school, meals, sleep, conversation, silence. Now, but beneath the surface of all of it, something invisible had shifted permanently. When you become aware of something sacred, the ordinary world begins to feel layered. Like two realities exist at once, the one everyone sees and the one only some can feel. I began watching my family differently, not suspiciously, not critically, attentively, because suddenly every small behavior felt significant. Every shift in tone, every pause, every moment of stillness. It was as though I was witnessing evidence of something I had only just begun to understand. My mother was the first sign, not because she said anything. She did not. She remained the same in her habits, her responsibilities, her routines. But something within her had softened even further. Her presence felt deeper, calmer, and as though she carried a peace that did not originate from effort. She began waking earlier than usual, not for work, not for chores, simply to sit quietly before the house stirred. I would sometimes pass the doorway and see her sitting still, eyes closed, hands relaxed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She did not look anxious. She looked anchored. This unsettled me at first, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt purposeful. And purpose implies direction. I started noticing similar changes in my father. He had always been disciplined, always structured, always reserved. But something about him was different now. His seriousness no longer felt rigid. His authority no longer felt tense. It felt grounded, gentle, intentionally restrained rather than emotionally distant. He became slower to anger, slower to judge, yet quicker to forgive, quicker to admit fault when he rarely would before. At first, I thought perhaps this was simply maturity, or stress, or exhaustion. But over time, the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Something was transforming him. and my siblings too. My younger sister became quieter in a way that did not feel withdrawn, but reflective. She began asking questions about meaning, about goodness, about the nature of love. Not theological questions, emotional ones. The kinds of questions that emerge when the heart begins to awaken. My younger brother, who had once been restless and impatient, began showing a gentleness I had never seen before. He became more considerate, more thoughtful, less reactive. It was as though something invisible was shaping all of us simultaneously. But the strangest part was that no one acknowledged it openly. We lived inside the transformation without speaking about it, like a current moving beneath still water. That silence became unbearable for me. Not because I wanted to disrupt anything, but because I needed to know if I was imagining it. If the experience I had encountered was personal delusion or part of something greater. The moment the silence broke did not happen dramatically. It happened through vulnerability. It was an evening like any other. The house was quiet, the air warm, the day ordinary. I was helping my mother in the kitchen, moving through familiar motions, when something inside me shifted. I cannot explain what compelled me to speak. Not recklessness, not rebellion, trust. Without planning, without rehearsing, without preparing, and I said that I had been experiencing something I did not understand. That I felt as though something beyond me had entered my life. That I felt known. That I felt changed. I did not name anything. I did not declare belief. I did not explain meaning. I simply confessed experience. And then I waited. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt before. Not uncomfortable, just dense, like the air before a storm. My mother did not respond immediately. She did not appear shocked. She did not appear confused. She did not appear concerned. She looked relieved. That relief startled me. She did not respond with explanation. She responded with emotion. Tears formed in her eyes, slowly, gently, without distress. Not tears of fear, tears of recognition. And in that moment, without a single word spoken in explanation, I understood something that changed everything. She had been experiencing it too, not imagining, not metaphorical, not symbolic, real. The recognition between us was undeniable, not because of shared language, but because of shared experience. It was not conversation that confirmed it. It was resonance. Over the next days, what had once been unspoken began to surface slowly. Not dramatically, not all at once, gradually, carefully. Because when something threatens to change the foundation of a family, it must be approached with reverence and caution. My mother began sharing fragments of her own experience. Not visions, not spectacles, moments of unexpected peace, moments of feeling known, moments of overwhelming love, moments of encountering something she could not rationalize but could not deny. She did not frame it as religion. She framed it as encounter. My father listened, not skeptically, not defensively, attentively. The more she spoke, the more something in him seemed to align with his own unspoken experiences. He had felt it too, not as intensely, not as frequently, but unmistakably. A presence during moments of exhaustion, a peace during moments of worry, a quiet clarity when he would otherwise feel overwhelmed. It was as though the transformation that had already begun in all of us had simply been waiting for acknowledgement. Once acknowledged, it accelerated. The atmosphere of our home changed profoundly, not externally, internally. The way we treated each other softened further. The way we listened deepened. The way we forgave became natural rather than effortful. The way we expressed care became more intentional. We began spending more time together, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. There was an unspoken sense that something sacred was unfolding among us. But we did not know how to define it, and that terrified us, because undefined change can be mistaken for danger. The realization that whatever we were experiencing was not isolated to me, not isolated to my mother, not isolated to one moment, but unfolding across our entire family raised a frightening question. What if this is real? Not emotionally real, not psychologically real, spiritually real. What if something was calling us collectively toward a truth that would alter our lives permanently? None of us voiced this fear aloud, but it existed, because even without naming it, we sensed that this kind of transformation does not come without cost. The world is not gentle with families that change quietly. The world is especially not gentle with families that change spiritually. So we did what many families do when confronted with something fragile and powerful. We hid. Not from shame, not from denial, from protection. We did not tell extended family. We did not tell friends. We did not tell neighbors. We kept everything contained within the walls of our home. But secrecy does not stop transformation. It only intensifies it. Because the more we attempted to preserve outward normalcy, the more the inward reality grew. We began developing new habits without consciously planning them. We sat in silence together more often. We reflected more deeply. We spoke more gently. We questioned old assumptions more carefully. The conversations within our home began shifting, not toward debate, toward truth. We began asking ourselves questions that previously would have felt forbidden. What is goodness? What is truth? What is love when it is unconditional? What is forgiveness when it is undeserved? What does it mean to be seen fully and still accepted? These were not academic discussions. They were personal explorations, and the more we explored, the clearer it became that we were not merely changing behavior. We were being reshaped at the core. The most difficult transformation came with my father. Not because he resisted, but because he felt the weight of responsibility most heavily. He was the protector of our family, the guardian of our safety, the one most aware of social consequences, the one most conscious of how quickly a family's reputation can shift. But he understood better than any of us that if what was happening within our home ever became visible externally, it would not be received neutrally. He carried the fear of that possibility silently. And yet, he could not deny the reality of what he was experiencing. I watched him struggle internally between protection and truth does not negotiate with fear. Over time, his struggle resolved not through rebellion, but through surrender. Not surrender to ideology, surrender to reality. He began acknowledging that whatever presence had entered our home was not destructive. It was not divisive. It was not destabilizing. It was healing. It was unifying. It was restoring. It was transforming us into a more compassionate, more patient, more loving family. And he could not rationally justify rejecting something that was producing undeniable fruit. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer controlled him. That was the moment I realized something profound. Our transformation was not emotional. It was structural. It was altering the foundation of who we were as individuals and as a family. We were not becoming rebellious. We were not becoming radical. We were not becoming disruptive. We were becoming softer, kinder, more honest, more aware, more anchored. That is what made it so dangerous. Because true transformation cannot be hidden forever. People notice when a family's atmosphere changes. They notice when conflict dissolves unusually quickly. They notice when peace becomes visible. They notice when something intangible shifts. At first, the changes remained subtle enough to escape attention. But over time, subtle transformations accumulate. The way we interacted with neighbors began to change. The way we spoke to shopkeepers softened. The way we responded to conflict became calmer. The way we carried ourselves felt lighter. People began commenting, not suspiciously, curiously. They said we seemed different, that our home felt peaceful, that there was something gentle about our presence. They did not know what they were observing, but they were observing it. That realization filled me with dread, because attention is the enemy of secrecy, and secrecy was the only thing protecting us. I began to understand the weight of what was unfolding. This was not a private emotional journey. This was not an individual transformation. This was a family being reshaped from the inside, and if it continued, it would eventually become visible to the outside world. Not through declarations, through behavior, through presence, through undeniable change. The most frightening realization came when I understood that what we were experiencing was not merely spiritual growth, it was alignment. Alignment with something that transcended our environment. Alignment with a truth that did not belong to culture. Alignment with something universal. We did not yet fully understand what that truth was, but we were moving toward it inevitably. The final moment that confirmed how fragile our secrecy truly was came unexpectedly. It was something small, seemingly insignificant, a moment of vulnerability. A recording made privately, words shared honestly, thoughts expressed without fear. I did not intend to share it widely. I did not intend for it to escape our safe space. But once truth is spoken authentically, it has momentum, and that momentum does not always respect intention. The recording did not remain private. It found its way beyond our walls, beyond our control, beyond our protection. At first, I did not understand the scale of what had happened. I did not realize that strangers were listening, that unknown people were sharing, that unseen audiences were reacting, until the first signs appeared. The sudden shift in how people looked at us, the strange awareness in conversations, the unspoken tension in familiar places. Something had changed externally, something irreversible. And that was when the fear truly arrived. Because transformation is one thing, exposure is another, and exposure brings consequences. And if you have followed this journey with your heart fully engaged, if you have felt the gradual escalation, if you sense that something fragile and sacred is unfolding beneath these words, then understand this. What happens next is not the continuation of transformation. It is collision. Collision between truth and perception. Collision between private faith and public awareness. Collision between safety and conviction. And once collision occurs, there is no path backward. If you are still here, still listening, still holding this story with care rather than curiosity, then do not disappear quietly now. Presence matters more in moments like these than at any other point in the journey. Sometimes simply staying with a story is an act of solidarity, even if you never speak aloud. It is strange how quickly life can fracture, not in visible ways, not with explosions or screams, not with dramatic announcements, but through subtle shifts. A look that lasts too long, a conversation that ends too abruptly, a silence that feels heavier than usual. At first, I did not understand what had changed. The days following the recording felt almost identical to the days before it. School continued, chores continued, our home remained physically the same, our routines stayed intact. On the surface, nothing had altered. But beneath that surface, a current of tension had begun to move. I felt it before I could name it, a faint awareness when I walked through familiar streets, a sense of being noticed when no one appeared to be watching, a subtle self-consciousness I had never experienced before. Not fear, not yet, but unease. And I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that perhaps I was simply more sensitive after everything that had unfolded within our home. That perhaps my mind was projecting danger where none existed. But intuition has a distinct tone when it is real, It does not shout. It does not panic. It whispers. And the whisper was consistent. Something had changed. The first external sign came through a friend at school, not through confrontation, not through accusation, through awkwardness. She avoided eye contact more than usual. Her responses were shorter, her energy uncertain. She behaved as though she wanted to ask something, but was unsure how to approach it. It was not hostility. It was confusion mixed with curiosity. I did not ask her what was wrong, because part of me already knew. Over the next few days, similar moments accumulated. I had a teacher who seemed to study me longer than necessary, a neighbor who paused mid-conversation when I passed by, a relative who called unexpectedly and spoke in vague tones. No one said anything directly, but something was circulating. And when something circulates without clarity, the imagination fills the gaps. That is when fear begins to grow. My parents noticed it too, not through evidence, not through information, through atmosphere. Families develop a sensitivity to each other's emotional states. When something threatens one member, it echoes through everyone. Our home grew quieter again, but not with peace, with caution. Not because we were panicking, but because we were listening. Listening for signs, listening for danger, listening for shifts. We began moving through the world more carefully, not hiding, but observing. The difference between secrecy and awareness is subtle. Secrecy is driven by fear. Awareness is driven by wisdom. We were not trying to erase what had happened. We were trying to understand its consequences. The realization that the recording had escaped our control began to settle more clearly. It was no longer abstract. It was no longer hypothetical. It was real. The truth had moved beyond our walls. And once something moves into the world, it does not return quietly. I began to understand how vulnerability, when exposed publicly, transforms into risk. Not because truth itself is dangerous, but because people interpret truth through the lens of their own fears, assumptions, and biases. Some people respond to sincerity with empathy, others respond with suspicion, others respond with hostility. Like you cannot control which response will arrive. That unpredictability is what unsettled me most. It was not the idea of being known, it was the idea of being misunderstood. Because misunderstanding carries consequences far heavier than disagreement. I began noticing subtle behavioral changes in those around us. Some people became overly kind, others became distant. Some seemed unsure how to behave around us. Others watched quietly. No one openly accused, no one openly confronted, but social distance began forming. And social distance in tightly connected communities is never accidental. I remember walking home one afternoon and feeling as though the entire street felt different. Not because anything had changed externally, but because I had changed internally. Yet I was now aware of how quickly perception shifts when people begin telling stories about you without your participation. I wondered what version of our family was being discussed in private conversations. Were we described as confused, as rebellious, as strange, as dangerous, as inspirational? I had no way of knowing. And that uncertainty is more frightening than any known threat. At home, we did not discuss specifics. Not because we were avoiding reality, but because we were trying to avoid panic. There is a delicate balance between preparation and fear. My parents walked that balance carefully. They did not want to burden us with worry, but they could not ignore what was unfolding. The shift in their behavior became more protective, not restrictive, not controlling, protective. They began paying closer attention to our routines, to where we went, to how much we shared, to what information left our home. Not because they wanted to suppress us, because they understood the world far better than we did. They knew how quickly communities can turn on what they do not understand. They knew how fragile reputation can be. They knew how dangerous rumors can become when fueled by misunderstanding. And they knew that once a story begins circulating, truth becomes secondary to perception. The emotional atmosphere in our home shifted again, not away from peace, toward vigilance, a different kind of peace, a peace that coexists with awareness. The hardest part was the waiting for clarity, waiting for consequences, waiting for something to happen. When danger is vague, the mind fills the silence with possibilities. Every scenario feels plausible. Every small event feels significant. Every unfamiliar sound feels like a warning. I began to understand why people fear exposure more than persecution. Exposure is uncertain. It leaves you suspended between possibilities. You do not know if you are safe. You do not know if you are seen. You do not know if something is coming. You only know that control has been lost. That loss of control is what shook me most deeply. Because the transformation we had experienced had felt guided, gentle, intentional, safe. Exposure felt chaotic, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And yet something strange occurred alongside the fear. Our unity deepened, not because we were trying to resist the world together, but because we were grounded in something deeper than fear. When families face uncertainty, they either fracture or they fuse. We fused, and our conversations grew more honest. Our attentiveness toward each other increased. Our emotional sensitivity heightened. We became more aware of one another's moods, more careful with our words, more present with our time. Not because we were trying to perform solidarity, but because fear has a way of stripping away superficiality. You either cling to what is real, or you lose everything. And what was real in our home was no longer tradition, reputation, or routine. What was real was the transformation we had undergone, the peace we had experienced, the love that had deepened between us, the internal clarity that had begun reshaping us. Those things could not be undone by exposure. They could be tested, they could be challenged, but they could not be erased. That realization became our anchor. Even as the world around us began shifting subtly, even as attention grew, even as uncertainty increased, the core of our family remained intact. Not because we were fearless, but because fear no longer governed us. The fear existed. We acknowledged it, but it did not control us. I began to see that the transformation we had undergone was not designed to make life easier. It was designed to make us stronger. Not emotionally stronger, not socially stronger, internally stronger. The kind of strength that remains stable when circumstances become unstable. The kind of strength that does not depend on safety. The kind of strength that does not require approval. That understanding came with a sobering awareness. If this path continued, comfort would not be guaranteed, safety would not be promised, reputation would not be preserved. You know, what would be preserved was something deeper. Truth. And truth is costly. I began noticing how my own perspective had shifted. Things that once felt terrifying now felt manageable. Things that once felt essential now felt superficial. Things that once felt fragile now felt resilient. The greatest shift was this. I was no longer afraid of losing what I had been. I was afraid of losing what I had become. That difference mattered. It meant that even if the world reacted poorly, even if relationships changed, even if perception shifted, I could not return to ignorance. The encounter had altered me permanently. The family transformation had reshaped us collectively. The exposure was simply revealing what had already occurred internally. You cannot hide authenticity forever, not because people will always see it, but because authenticity changes behavior, and behavior reveals truth. Our home could not conceal its atmosphere indefinitely. People feel peace. People sense kindness. People recognize when something has shifted. We did not advertise anything, but we could not erase what we had become. The days grew heavier as awareness deepened, not heavier with dread, heavier with gravity, with the recognition that we were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The final realization of this chapter came when I understood that the most difficult part of this journey was not behind us, it was ahead of us. Transformation had been gentle, exposure had been unsettling, but what follows exposure is decision. When something private becomes public, when conviction becomes visible, when truth stands in the open, yet there is always a moment where silence is no longer possible. A moment where a family must decide, do we retreat? Do we conceal? Do we deny? Do we soften the truth? Or do we stand quietly but firmly in what has transformed us? That decision had not yet arrived, but it was approaching. I could feel it in the air, not as threat, as inevitability. The next step in this journey would not be emotional. It would be practical. It would involve real choices, real consequences, real courage. And the most difficult moment of all was still waiting, because the final challenge would not come from strangers. It would come from within our own circle, from relationships that mattered, from people we loved, from connections we could not simply walk away from. That is where true testing occurs, not when the world opposes you, but when love is tested by truth. And that moment was closer than I was ready to admit. Final chapter, the reveal, the cost, and the return. There is a point in every transformation where silence becomes heavier than truth. Not because silence is wrong, but because silence begins to suffocate what is real. That point arrived for our family slowly, then all at once. We had lived for months in careful awareness, not hiding in fear, but protecting what was sacred, not denying what had happened, but honoring it privately. We had learned to exist in that delicate space between transformation and exposure, between conviction and caution. But something had changed, not outside, inside. The peace that had first entered our home gently had deepened into something stronger, something more anchored, something that no longer felt fragile. It felt permanent. And when something becomes permanent, it demands alignment. You cannot carry truth deeply and continue pretending outwardly forever. Eventually, the tension between who you are and who you appear to be becomes unbearable. That tension began to press on all of us. Not dramatically, not explosively, gradually. I saw it in my father most clearly. He had always carried responsibility heavily. But now he carried something else alongside it. Conviction. Not loud, not aggressive, just immovable. I could see that he was no longer asking whether what we had experienced was real. That question had already been answered in his heart. The question he now carried was more difficult. With what does truth require of us? That question haunted our home, not through conflict, through stillness. We all felt it. The knowledge that we could no longer remain suspended between worlds, that we could no longer live transformed internally while pretending unchanged externally. That at some point, we would need to decide whether the transformation was something we merely protected or something we honored openly. This was not a conversation we held. It was a reality we inhabited. The reveal did not come through confrontation. It did not come through argument. It did not come through crisis. It came through clarity. One evening, sitting in the quiet of our home, I became aware of something I had never allowed myself to fully articulate. The transformation we had experienced was not only changing how we felt, it was changing who we were. And not culturally, not socially, spiritually. We were no longer just a family that had experienced something unusual. We were becoming a family shaped by Christ, not by label, not by institution, by reality, by presence, by peace, by love, by conviction. That realization frightened me. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt costly. Because I knew enough about the world to understand that following truth deeply rarely leads to ease. It often leads to misunderstanding, to loss, to rejection, to isolation. And yet, the strange thing was this. The fear no longer outweighed the peace. Months earlier, the idea of exposure had terrified me. The idea of being known had unsettled me. The idea of standing openly in conviction had felt impossible. Now, those fears felt smaller, not gone, just smaller. It's because something greater had grown in their place. Trust. Not trust in outcome, not trust in safety. Trust in truth. The final reveal, the one thing I had not spoken about until now, was the moment that sealed everything. It happened quietly, like everything else that mattered most. There was no vision, no dramatic event, no spectacle, just understanding. I was sitting alone in my room, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. The journey, the transformation, the fear, the secrecy, the exposure, the uncertainty. And suddenly I understood something I had never allowed myself to see clearly. This entire journey was never about secrecy. It was about preparation. We had been given time to change, time to grow, time to anchor ourselves, time to build unity, time to deepen conviction quietly before exposure arrived. Where the transformation had unfolded privately, not because it was meant to remain hidden forever, but because it needed to become strong before it could ever survive being seen. That realization changed everything. We were not being asked to hide. We were being given space to grow. We were not being protected from the world. We were being prepared for it. This was the final piece. The understanding that the peace we had received was not fragile. It was resilient. That the love we had encountered was not conditional. It was sustaining. That the presence that had reshaped us was not something that disappeared when circumstances grew difficult. It was something that remained. And in that realization, something inside me settled permanently. I was no longer waiting for permission to believe. I was no longer waiting for certainty. I was no longer waiting for safety. I was simply rooted. Not in rebellion, not in defiance, in truth. That grounding changed the way I viewed everything that had happened to us. The exposure, the whispers, the tension, the uncertainty, the fear. None of it was meaningless. None of it was random. All of it was part of a larger shaping. We were not victims of circumstance. We were participants in transformation. The cost became clear. We might lose comfort. We might lose approval. We might lose relationships. We might lose reputation. But what we had gained was deeper. We had gained unity. We had gained peace. We had gained identity. We had gained truth. Those things are not easily taken. The final shift in our family did not come through a dramatic declaration. It came through quiet alignment, through consistency, and through the way we began living outwardly in alignment with what had already transformed us inwardly. We did not announce anything to the world. We did not proclaim anything publicly. We did not provoke or challenge anyone. We simply lived differently, more gently, more honestly, more compassionately, more intentionally. And that, more than any words ever could, became our testimony. People noticed, not because we told them, but because authenticity cannot be concealed forever. The most powerful reveal was not something spoken. It was something embodied. We became living evidence of transformation. Not perfect, not elevated, not superior, simply changed. And that change carried weight. I began to understand that faith, real faith, is not something declared loudly. It is something lived quietly. It is not found in performance. It is found in fruit, in patience where there once was impatience, in kindness where there once was defensiveness, in peace where there once was anxiety, in humility where there once was pride. That is how the transformation became undeniable, not through words, through life. The spiritual resolution did not arrive as a conclusion. It arrived as a commitment, not formal, not ceremonial, internal. A settled decision that no matter what came next, no matter how uncertain the path became, no matter what the world decided to believe about us, we would not return to who we had been before. Because what we had encountered was not ideology, it was reality. It was Christ, not as a symbol, not as a concept, as presence, as truth, as transformation. The cost was real. The uncertainty remains real. The risks have not disappeared. But the fear no longer dominates. Because when you have encountered a love that does not demand performance, a truth that does not rely on approval, and a peace that does not collapse under pressure, you cannot pretend you have not. You cannot unexperience it. You cannot unknow it. You can only decide what you will do with it. This story does not end with safety guaranteed. It does not end with every fear resolved. It does not end with life becoming easier. It ends with clarity, with the understanding that truth is worth the cost, that transformation is worth the risk, that love is worth the surrender. We are still living this journey. We are still learning. We are still navigating. But we are no longer uncertain about who we are becoming. We are becoming people shaped by grace, by humility, by compassion, by truth. That we are becoming a family anchored not by tradition, not by appearance, not by reputation, but by something far deeper. By Christ. If you have listened all the way to the end of this story, you did not do so by accident. Stories like this do not hold attention through curiosity alone. They resonate because they awaken something familiar in the heart. Perhaps you recognize the quiet questions. Perhaps you recognize the restlessness. Perhaps you recognize the longing. Perhaps you recognize the fear of truth. If something in you responded to this story, if something stirred that you cannot easily explain, do not ignore it too quickly. Moments of recognition are rare, and they matter. If you reached this point, stayed through the uncertainty, through the tension, through the transformation, then you are not just a passive listener. And you are someone who chose to remain present with a story that required patience, depth, and reflection. That kind of attention is not casual. And if this journey meant something to you, if it resonated with something unspoken in your own heart, then do not let it end silently. Let this moment mark something. Not for visibility, not for validation, but for honesty. Acknowledge that you were here. Acknowledge that you listened. Acknowledge that it mattered, because sometimes the smallest response is the first step toward the deepest transformation.